Imagine a single moment, one mistake, one miscalculation that could have ended civilization as we know it. Not in the corridors of political power, not in the missile silos buried beneath the plains of Middle America, but out there on the cold, dark waters of the world's oceans, aboard United States Navy vessels carrying weapons powerful enough to destroy entire continents. Today, we're diving deep into the classified files, the declassified reports, and the terrifying testimonies of sailors who stood at the very edge of nuclear catastrophe. This is the story of nuclear close calls at sea, the near accidents that almost changed everything, the moments when humanity's survival hung by the thinnest of threads, held together only by luck, quick thinking, and sometimes nothing more than chance itself. The history of nuclear weapons at sea is as vast and deep as the oceans themselves. When the United States Navy first began deploying nuclear weapons aboard its vessels in the 1950s, it marked a fundamental shift in naval warfare and global security. These weren't just bombs or missiles. These were instruments of apocalyptic power, each one capable of releasing energy equivalent to thousands or even millions of tons of conventional explosives. The Navy had transformed from a conventional fighting force into a nuclear power, capable of projecting devastating force from beneath the waves and from the decks of aircraft carriers traversing every ocean on Earth. But with this incredible power came incredible risk. Nuclear weapons are complex systems, requiring precise engineering, careful handling, and constant vigilance. Aboard a ship, these challenges multiply exponentially. You have the constant motion of the sea, the corrosive salt air, the cramped spaces where thousands of sailors work and live in close proximity to weapons that could vaporize entire cities. You have the stress of long deployments, the fatigue that sets in during endless watches, the human factor that no amount of training can completely eliminate. The close calls began almost immediately. In the early days of the nuclear navy, procedures were still being developed, safety protocols were evolving, and the technology itself was new and sometimes unpredictable. Sailors were learning on the job, figuring out how to handle these weapons in real-world conditions that the designers and engineers back on land could never fully anticipate. And mistakes happened. Near disasters occurred with frightening regularity, though many of them remained classified for decades, hidden from public view to avoid panic and to protect national security secrets. One of the earliest documented incidents occurred in the 1950s aboard an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. The details remained classified for over 40 years, but when they finally emerged, they painted a chilling picture. A nuclear bomb being moved on the hangar deck broke free from its restraints during rough seas. The weapon, weighing several thousand pounds, slid across the deck, crashing into equipment and narrowly missing sailors scrambling to get out of its path. The bomb's conventional explosives, designed to trigger the nuclear reaction, were armed. If they had detonated from the impact, the result might not have been a nuclear explosion, but it would have spread radioactive material across the ship and possibly caused enough damage to sink the vessel. Hundreds of men could have died. The radioactive contamination could have rendered a huge area of the Pacific Ocean dangerous for years. The crew managed to secure the weapon after several terrifying minutes. An investigation followed, leading to changes in how nuclear weapons were stored and transported aboard ships. But the incident highlighted a fundamental truth that would be proven again and again over the coming decades. When you put nuclear weapons on ships, on platforms that move constantly, that operate in harsh environments, that are manned by human beings who get tired and make mistakes, you are accepting a level of risk that is almost incomprehensible. The 1960s brought new challenges and new close calls. The Navy was expanding its nuclear arsenal at sea, deploying ballistic missile submarines that could hide beneath the waves and launch nuclear strikes from anywhere in the world. These submarines, the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent, carried enough firepower to destroy entire nations. They were technological marvels, but they were also pressure cookers of tension and risk. Submarine crews lived for months at a time in confined spaces, breathing recycled air, never seeing the sun, always aware that they were surrounded by weapons of mass destruction. In 1961, a fire broke out aboard a nuclear submarine during a training exercise off the East Coast. The fire started in the torpedo room, where conventional torpedoes were stored alongside nuclear-tipped anti-submarine weapons. Smoke filled the compartments. Men struggled to breathe as they fought to contain the flames. The heat was intense, and everyone aboard knew that if the fire reached the nuclear weapons, the consequences could be catastrophic. The weapons themselves might not detonate in a full nuclear explosion without the proper triggering sequence, but the conventional explosives could blow the submarine apart, sending it and its crew to the bottom of the ocean and potentially releasing radioactive material into the water. The crew fought that fire with everything they had. They used every fire suppression system aboard, every extinguisher, every technique they had been trained on. And they won. They contained the blaze, saved the submarine, and prevented what could have been one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. But it was close, closer than the public would know for many years. The men who fought that fire carried the memory of those terrifying hours for the rest of their lives, knowing that they had stood between the world and disaster. The Mediterranean Sea became another stage for nuclear close calls throughout the Cold War. The Sixth Fleet operated there continuously, projecting American power in a region of vital strategic importance. Aircraft carriers loaded with nuclear weapons cruised those waters, often in close proximity to Soviet vessels also armed with nuclear weapons. The potential for miscalculation, for an accident that could trigger a wider conflict, was ever present. In 1965, an aircraft carrying a nuclear bomb rolled off the deck of an aircraft carrier during a training operation in the Mediterranean. The plane, the bomb, and the pilot all disappeared beneath the waves in water thousands of feet deep. Search operations began immediately, but the Mediterranean floor in that region is treacherous, a landscape of underwater canyons and mountains. The bomb was never recovered. It remains there to this day, somewhere in the depths, its nuclear material slowly corroding in the salt water, a reminder of how easily these weapons can be lost, how quickly control can slip away. The pilot's body was never found either. His family received a folded flag and the thanks of a grateful nation, but they never learned all the details of what happened that day, what their son and father had been carrying when he went into the water. The incident was classified for decades. When it finally became public, it raised troubling questions about how many other nuclear weapons might be lying on the ocean floor, lost in accidents that were never fully disclosed. The 1970s brought technological advances, but also new risks. Nuclear weapons became more sophisticated, more powerful, more compact. The Navy could fit more warheads on each missile, more missiles on each submarine. The destructive power concentrated aboard a single vessel increased exponentially. A single submarine could now carry enough nuclear weapons to destroy dozens of cities, to kill millions of people. The responsibility weighing on the crews of these vessels was almost unbearable. In 1975, a collision occurred between a nuclear submarine and a Soviet vessel in the North Atlantic. The exact details remained classified for decades, but the incident brought the two superpowers dangerously close to a confrontation that could have escalated beyond anyone's control. The submarine sustained damage. Water began flooding into compartments. The crew scrambled to stabilize the vessel, to prevent it from sinking into the black depths of the Atlantic with its full load of nuclear missiles. They succeeded, but barely. The submarine limped back to port, where inspectors found that the damage had come within inches of breaching the missile compartment itself. If water had flooded that compartment, if the delicate systems that controlled and safeguarded those missiles had been compromised, the results could have been catastrophic. The missiles might have become unstable. Their fuel could have ignited. At worst, the nuclear warheads themselves might have been damaged in ways that could lead to a release of radioactive material or even an unintended detonation. The crew had no way of knowing, in those desperate hours after the collision, just how close they had come to disaster. They just did their jobs, followed their training, and fought to save their ship. The Cold War reached its peak of tension in the 1980s. The United States and the Soviet Union faced each other with nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. At sea, the confrontations became more frequent, more aggressive. Soviet submarines trailed American aircraft carriers. American attack submarines hunted Soviet ballistic missile submarines. The game of cat and mouse played out in every ocean, beneath the waves and on the surface, with nuclear weapons always present, always ready. In 1983, during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, an incident occurred in the Pacific that came terrifyingly close to disaster. A nuclear submarine was conducting operations near Soviet waters when its reactor experienced a malfunction. The reactor, which powered the submarine and allowed it to remain submerged for months at a time, began to overheat. Temperatures climbed past safe levels. Alarms sounded throughout the vessel. The crew initiated emergency procedures, but the reactor continued to heat up. If a nuclear reactor melts down aboard a submarine, the consequences are almost unimaginable. The crew cannot evacuate. They are trapped inside a steel tube deep underwater, with a reactor that is becoming increasingly unstable. Radioactive steam and gases can fill the compartments. The heat can become so intense that it melts through the pressure hull itself. And even if the crew manages to surface the submarine, they are still trapped aboard a radioactive vessel that no rescue ship can safely approach. The crew of that submarine fought to control the reactor for hours. They manually operated systems that had failed. They bypassed safety protocols designed to shut down the reactor completely because doing so would leave them without power, unable to surface, doomed to sink to the bottom of the Pacific. It was a calculated risk, a desperate gamble. And it worked. They brought the reactor back under control, cooled it down, stabilized the submarine. But for several hours, those men faced the very real possibility that they would die in that submarine, killed by radiation or trapped on the bottom of the ocean or forced to surface in Soviet waters where they would be captured. The incident was classified at the highest levels. The crew was sworn to secrecy. Some of them would not speak about what happened for decades, and even then, only in vague terms. The full details may never be known. But what is known is enough to understand how close we came to losing a nuclear submarine and potentially triggering an international incident that could have spiraled out of control during one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. Aircraft carriers presented their own unique challenges and risks. These massive vessels, floating cities with crews of thousands, carried dozens of nuclear weapons. Nuclear bombs were stored in the magazines deep within the ship. Nuclear depth charges and missiles were positioned throughout the vessel, ready to be loaded onto aircraft at a moment's notice. The logistics of managing all these weapons, of moving them safely through the ship, of loading them onto aircraft on a crowded flight deck with planes taking off and landing constantly, were staggeringly complex. In 1984, a fire broke out aboard an aircraft carrier during operations in the Indian Ocean. The fire started in a maintenance area, but quickly spread through the ship's ventilation systems. Smoke filled compartments throughout the vessel. The fire was racing toward the forward magazines where nuclear weapons were stored. The crew had minutes, perhaps only seconds, to stop the fire before it reached those magazines. Sailors fought that fire with a courage and determination that defies description. They ran toward the flames, not away from them. They knew what was at stake. They knew that if the fire reached the nuclear weapons, the conventional explosives surrounding the nuclear cores could detonate, ripping the ship apart, sending it to the bottom of the Indian Ocean with thousands of men aboard. They used every fire suppression system, every hose, every extinguisher. They created fire breaks by sealing off compartments and flooding them with water and foam. And they stopped the fire just 30 feet from the magazines. 30 feet. That was the margin. 30 feet between normalcy and catastrophe, between a fire that would be forgotten within weeks and a disaster that would have changed history. The men who fought that fire were decorated for their bravery, but most of them never spoke publicly about what happened. They carried the weight of that knowledge privately, understanding that they had saved not just their ship and their shipmates, but possibly prevented a nuclear accident that could have had global implications. The end of the Cold War did not end the risks. Nuclear weapons remained aboard Navy vessels. Submarines still patrolled the oceans with ballistic missiles. Aircraft carriers still deployed with nuclear-capable aircraft. The operational tempo decreased somewhat, but the weapons remained, and so did the potential for accidents. In the 1990s, a series of incidents involving nuclear submarines raised new concerns about the aging of these vessels and their systems. Submarines that had been built in the 1960s and 70s were still in service, their hulls fatigued from decades of diving cycles, their systems outdated and increasingly difficult to maintain. Several submarines experienced flooding, fires, and other emergencies that could have led to catastrophic failures if not for the quick response of their crews. One incident that came to light years later involved a submarine that experienced a loss of propulsion while submerged in the Arctic Ocean. The submarine began to sink, unable to control its depth. The crew initiated emergency procedures, but the submarine continued to descend toward its crushed depth, the point at which the pressure of the water would collapse the hull like a tin can. The men aboard that submarine knew they were minutes away from death. They could hear the hull groaning under the increasing pressure. Rivets were popping. Small leaks were appearing as seals began to fail. In a desperate last effort, the crew managed to restart one of the submarine's emergency propulsion systems. The submarine leveled off just 100 feet above its crushed depth. They slowly brought it back to the surface, where they discovered that a series of mechanical failures, compounded by human error, had nearly killed them all. The submarine carried 16 ballistic missiles, each with multiple nuclear warheads. If it had been crushed at depth, those missiles and warheads would have been scattered across the Arctic seafloor, their nuclear material eventually leaking into the ocean, creating a radioactive hazard that could persist for thousands of years. The post-9/11 era brought new security concerns. The threat of terrorism raised fears that nuclear weapons aboard Navy vessels could be targeted by terrorists seeking to steal nuclear material or cause a nuclear accident. Security protocols were enhanced dramatically. The Navy implemented new training programs, new surveillance systems, new procedures for guarding and accounting for nuclear weapons. But the fundamental risks remained. As long as nuclear weapons are at sea, aboard ships and submarines operating in challenging environments, the potential for accidents exists. In 2005, an incident aboard a nuclear submarine highlighted how even the most advanced safety systems can fail. A valve malfunction caused seawater to flood into the submarine while it was submerged in the Atlantic. The flooding was rapid and catastrophic. Within minutes, water had filled several compartments. The submarine began to lose depth control, tilting at a dangerous angle. The crew fought to close emergency hatches, to isolate the flooding, to regain control of the vessel. They were successful, but the investigation that followed revealed that the valve had failed due to improper maintenance, a reminder that human factors remain the weakest link in nuclear safety. These stories, these incidents, represent only the ones we know about. Many others remain classified. Some may never be disclosed. The full extent of how many times we have come close to nuclear disaster at sea may never be fully understood by the public. But what we do know is sobering enough. We know that luck has played a role in preventing catastrophe. We know that brave sailors have stood between us and nuclear accidents that could have killed thousands and contaminated vast areas of the ocean. We know that the systems designed to prevent accidents are not perfect, that they have failed multiple times, and that only human intervention, courage, and sometimes sheer chance have prevented the worst. The men who serve aboard nuclear vessels live with this knowledge every day. They understand the power of the weapons they guard. They know the risks. They train endlessly to prevent accidents and to respond if accidents occur. They operate under pressures that most of us can barely imagine, living for months at a time in confined spaces, separated from their families, carrying responsibilities that could affect millions of lives. The psychological toll is immense. The stress is constant, yet they do their jobs with professionalism and dedication. The question we must ask ourselves is whether the risks are worth it. Is the deterrent value of nuclear weapons at sea worth the danger of accidents? Is the strategic advantage gained by having submarines capable of launching nuclear missiles from anywhere in the world's oceans worth the possibility that one of those submarines could be lost in an accident, spreading radioactive contamination across the ocean floor? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers. What is clear is that as long as nuclear weapons remain aboard Navy vessels, we must demand the highest levels of safety, training, and accountability. We must ensure that the lessons learned from past close calls are never forgotten. We must support the men and women who serve aboard these vessels, who carry burdens that most of us will never fully understand. And we must remain vigilant, because the next close call could be the one where luck runs out. The history of nuclear close calls at sea is a history of near misses, of moments when everything almost went wrong but didn't. It is a history of human courage and human fallibility, of technology that is both marvelous and terrifying. It is a reminder that we live in a world where weapons of unimaginable power exist, where they are deployed on platforms that operate in some of the harshest environments on Earth, and where the margin for error is sometimes measured in feet, in seconds, in the difference between a valve holding and a valve failing. As we move forward into an uncertain future, as new powers develop nuclear weapons and new technologies change the nature of naval warfare, the lessons of the past become even more important. We must remember what happened in the Mediterranean in 1965, in the Pacific in 1983, in the Atlantic in 2005. We must remember the fires that almost reached the magazines, the submarines that almost sank, the bombs that almost fell into the wrong hands or into the ocean depths. We must remember not to create fear, but to create awareness, to ensure that we never become complacent about the risks we have accepted. The sailors who have stood watch over these weapons, who have fought fires and floods and mechanical failures, who have kept their cool in moments of crisis, deserve our recognition and our gratitude. They have protected us not just from our adversaries, but from the very weapons that are supposed to protect us. They are the last line of defense against accidents that could have consequences beyond imagination. Their stories, the ones we know and the ones we will never hear, are a crucial part of our naval history and our nuclear history. Today, the United States Navy continues to operate nuclear weapons at sea. Submarines patrol the depths with ballistic missiles. The technology has improved. The training is better. The safety protocols are more sophisticated. But the fundamental nature of the challenge remains unchanged. You cannot eliminate all risk when you put nuclear weapons on ships and submarines. You can only manage it, minimize it, prepare for it. And you must rely on the skill, dedication, and courage of the men and women who serve. The story of nuclear close calls at sea is ongoing. It did not end with the Cold War. It has not ended today. As long as these weapons exist, as long as they are deployed aboard vessels operating in the world's oceans, the potential for accidents will remain. Our responsibility is to learn from the past, to remain vigilant in the present, and to work toward a future where perhaps these weapons are no longer necessary. Until that day comes, we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to never forget how close we have come to disaster, and to honor those who have stood between us and catastrophe. The ocean keeps many secrets. Some of them are nuclear weapons, lost in accidents, corroding on the seafloor. Others are the stories of near disasters prevented, of moments when everything could have gone wrong but didn't. These secrets remind us of the true cost of nuclear deterrence, paid not just in dollars but in risk, in the lives of those who serve, and in the moments when luck was the only thing between us and unthinkable tragedy.